Brooklyn, New York, March 1918. Frankie Yale's voice cut through the Harvard Inn's smoky air like a blade through silk, each word carrying the weight of finality and the sting of betrayal. "You're done here, Alphonse. Pack your bags and get on the next train to Chicago." Al Capone stood frozen in disbelief, his 19-year-old mind struggling to process what sounded like a death sentence disguised as exile. The conversation that followed lasted less than 5 minutes, but it would echo through American crime history for decades. Yale spoke with the calm authority of a man delivering inevitable justice, explaining that Capone had become too visible, too reckless, too dangerous for Brooklyn's delicate ecosystem. What looked like punishment was actually salvation, though neither man could admit that truth in a room where walls had ears and loyalty was currency. The train ticket to Chicago sat on Yale's desk like a passport to an unknown future, and young Capone stared at it with the same expression a condemned man might reserve for his final meal. He thought his career was ending before it had truly begun. Instead, he was about to become a king. The path to exile had been carved by ambition and paved with bodies, though nobody understood the full scope of the conspiracy until blood started flowing in directions that threatened everyone's survival. Brooklyn's underworld operated according to rules that had evolved over decades of violence and negotiation, a complex web of territories and allegiances that kept different ethnic groups from destroying each other completely. Irish gangs controlled the docks with iron fists and brass knuckles, extracting tribute from every ship that loaded or unloaded cargo, while maintaining the kind of discipline that made longshoremen more afraid of their own protection than they were of industrial accidents. Italian families ran the gambling operations and protection rackets with mathematical precision, understanding that consistent profits required consistent enforcement and that reputation was more valuable than any single collection. Jewish businessmen provided the financial infrastructure that made everything possible, laundering money through legitimate enterprises while maintaining the kind of political connections that kept investigations superficial and prosecutions rare. The balance was delicate but immensely profitable, maintained through a combination of mutual respect and mutual deterrence that served everyone's interests as long as nobody got too greedy, too ambitious, or too visible. Al Capone had been rising through Frankie Yale's organization with the kind of meteoric speed that made older criminals nervous and rival gangs vigilant, displaying natural leadership qualities that couldn't be taught, and strategic instincts that seemed to have been born rather than developed. At 19, he already commanded respect that men twice his age struggled to earn, combining physical presence that intimidated potential enemies with strategic intelligence that impressed potential allies and an intuitive understanding of power dynamics that couldn't be taught in any school or learned from any book. Yale had been grooming him for larger responsibilities with the careful attention that master craftsmen reserved for their most promising apprentices, using him as muscle for collections and negotiations while gradually exposing him to the business side of criminal enterprise, the careful bookkeeping that tracked debts and payments, the diplomatic conversations that prevented conflicts before they required violence, and the strategic planning that turned territorial disputes into profitable partnerships. But success in Brooklyn's underworld was a double-edged sword that cut both ways with mathematical precision, and young Capone was beginning to understand that visibility could be more dangerous than anonymity, especially when that visibility attracted attention from people who preferred their competitors buried in potter's fields rather than successful in competing territories. The White Hand Gang had been watching Al Capone's rise with the kind of cold calculation that preceded systematic elimination of threats to their territorial control. Led by Irish longshoremen who understood violence as both business tool and personal expression, the White Hand specialized in the kind of brutal efficiency that kept dock workers in line and rival organizations respectful. Their leader, Dinny Mahan, had built his reputation on the principle that problems should be solved permanently rather than temporarily, and he viewed Capone's growing influence as exactly the kind of problem that required permanent solutions. The Italians were getting too comfortable in neighborhoods that had traditionally belonged to Irish families, taking over businesses and protection routes that generated substantial revenue for White Hand operations. Worse, young Capone had been involved in several incidents that had resulted in White Hand members getting hurt or arrested, creating the kind of personal animosity that transformed business disputes into blood feuds. Mahon began planning Capone's assassination with the methodical approach of a military strategist, studying his routines and identifying vulnerabilities while building support among other Irish gangs who shared his concerns about Italian expansion. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate Capone during one of his regular collection rounds, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, and send a message to Yale's organization that certain boundaries were not negotiable. What Mahon didn't understand was that Frankie Yale had survived decades in Brooklyn's underworld by maintaining intelligence networks that reached into every gang and every neighborhood, including his own. The confrontation that sealed Al Capone's fate in New York erupted on a cold February night outside Torino's restaurant, where business disputes and personal grudges finally collided in the kind of violence that left witnesses traumatized and authorities confused about what had actually transpired. The restaurant sat on the disputed boundary between Italian and Irish territory, a symbolic location that had been the site of numerous previous confrontations and would likely host many more before the underlying territorial issues were resolved through either negotiation or elimination. Capone had been collecting protection money from local merchants when he encountered three white-hand enforcers who had been drinking heavily at Murphy's Tavern and looking for Italian targets to intimidate as part of their organization's systematic campaign to reclaim disputed territory. The conversation started with ethnic slurs that questioned both Capone's heritage and his right to conduct business in what the Irish considered their ancestral neighborhood, escalating through threats about what happened to Italians who forgot their place in Brooklyn's carefully established hierarchy. The three enforcers positioned themselves strategically to prevent Capone's retreat, while making their intentions clear through the kind of body language that preceded serious violence rather than mere intimidation. But this wasn't just another neighborhood scuffle between young men testing their courage and settling personal scores with fists and bottles. This was a carefully orchestrated provocation designed to create the kind of public incident that would justify more serious retaliation from white-hand leadership while simultaneously demonstrating Irish dominance to merchants who might be considering switching their loyalty to Italian protection. The three Irish enforcers pushed Capone into exactly the kind of response they wanted and needed for their larger strategic purposes, forcing him to choose between backing down in front of witnesses who would spread news of his cowardice throughout the neighborhood, or defending himself with violence that would be reported to their superiors as unprovoked Italian aggression. When the fight ended with two white-hand members unconscious in the restaurant's doorway and the third stumbling toward Murphy's Tavern with a broken nose and stories about Italian brutality, the incident provided both sides with exactly what they thought they wanted: justification for escalation that would either resolve the territorial dispute permanently or transform it into the kind of neighborhood war that consumed entire blocks. The twist came not in the form of violence, but in the form of wisdom, as Frankie Yale demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that separated successful crime bosses from dead ones. Yale could have responded to the white-hand threat with the traditional escalation that would have turned Brooklyn into a war zone, marshalling his forces for the kind of bloody conflict that would have satisfied honor while destroying profits. Instead, he chose a solution that looked like betrayal but functioned as salvation, recognizing that sometimes protecting someone meant sending them away rather than standing beside them in a fight they couldn't win. The conversation with Johnny Torrio in Chicago had taken place weeks earlier, a casual exchange between old friends that suddenly became the foundation for a plan that would preserve both Capone's life and Yale's business interests. Torrio had been asking for reliable muscle to help him expand his operations in Chicago's rapidly evolving underworld, and Yale had been considering various candidates from his organization who might benefit from experience in a larger market. The white-hand death threat transformed a casual conversation into an urgent relocation, but Yale understood that presenting it as such would damage both his reputation and Capone's pride. The exile had to look like punishment rather than protection, discipline rather than rescue, in order to maintain the appearance of strength that kept other gangs respectful and other subordinates loyal. When Yale delivered the ultimatum to Capone in his Harvard Inn office, he was simultaneously saving a valuable protege and maintaining the kind of organizational discipline that prevented future challenges to his authority. The fallout from Capone's exile rippled through Brooklyn's underworld with consequences that nobody fully anticipated, reshaping alliances and expectations in ways that would influence East Coast organized crime for decades, while simultaneously creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed if the territorial dispute had been resolved through traditional violence. Capone's departure removed a valuable asset from Yale's organization, but also eliminated a primary source of friction with the White Hand Gang, allowing both groups to return to the kind of profitable coexistence that served everyone's long-term interests better than the alternative of sustained warfare over territorial boundaries that generated more headlines than revenue. The train ride to Chicago became a journey of transformation for Capone, who spent the long hours staring out windows at landscapes that represented both exile and opportunity, forests and farmland that stretched between his familiar past and his uncertain future. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on steel tracks provided a soundtrack for contemplation that would have been impossible in Brooklyn's constant noise and activity, giving him time to consider lessons learned and mistakes made while planning for possibilities that existed beyond the territorial limitations of New York's established criminal hierarchy. Johnny Torrio met him at Union Station with the kind of warm welcome that suggested business partnerships rather than mere employment, immediately recognizing in young Capone the combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that his rapidly expanding Chicago operations required for the kind of systematic growth that he had been planning but couldn't execute without reliable lieutenants. The city that greeted Capone was simultaneously more sophisticated and more violent than Brooklyn, with opportunities for advancement that didn't exist in New York's established territorial boundaries and challenges that would require new approaches to familiar problems. The prohibition movement was gaining momentum throughout the Midwest, creating opportunities for criminal enterprises that understood the economic principles governing markets for illegal commodities, and Chicago's geographic location made it the natural distribution center for alcohol smuggling operations that would eventually span multiple states. Within months, Capone was handling responsibilities that would have taken years to earn in Yale's carefully stratified organization, learning lessons about large-scale criminal enterprise that transformed him from Brooklyn muscle into Chicago strategist, from neighborhood enforcer into regional commander. The exile that had seemed like career destruction became career acceleration of unprecedented magnitude, and the punishment that had felt like betrayal revealed itself as the most valuable gift anyone had ever given him, a forced opportunity to discover capabilities and ambitions that never would have been tested in Brooklyn's familiar limitations. Chicago would remember March 1918 as the month that destiny arrived on a train from Brooklyn, carrying ambitions that would reshape the city's criminal landscape and establish new models for organized crime throughout America. The young man who stepped onto the platform at Union Station was still recognizably the same Al Capone who had carved his reputation in Brooklyn's violent streets, but the city that welcomed him would forge him into something entirely different, a criminal statesman who understood that true power came from organization rather than intimidation, from business acumen rather than just physical courage. The lessons he had learned in Brooklyn about loyalty and respect provided the foundation for what he would build in Chicago, but the scale and sophistication of Midwestern criminal enterprise taught him new concepts about territory and influence that transcended neighborhood boundaries. Within 5 years, he would control an empire that stretched across multiple states and generated revenue that rivaled legitimate corporations, employing hundreds of people in an organization that functioned with military precision and business efficiency. The exile from Brooklyn became the origin story of the most successful criminal enterprise in American history, proof that sometimes the most devastating setbacks are actually disguised opportunities for unprecedented advancement. Frankie Yale's decision to send Capone away, rather than stand beside him in a doomed fight, demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that separated temporary survivors from permanent legends. The man who left Brooklyn thought he was running from his problems. The king who emerged in Chicago understood that he had actually been running toward his destiny. The legend was born in exile and refined in anonymity, growing in power and sophistication until it could no longer be contained by geographic boundaries or legal restrictions. Every empire needs a founding myth, a story that explains how ordinary men become extraordinary leaders, And for Al Capone, that story began with what looked like the worst day of his young life, but revealed itself as the most important decision anyone had ever made on his behalf. The train ticket that had seemed like a one-way passage to obscurity became the first page in a story that would captivate America and terrify law enforcement for more than a decade. Chicago's streets would run red with the blood of his enemies and flow green with the money of his empire, but none of that would have been possible without Frankie Yale's wisdom in recognizing that sometimes protecting someone meant pushing them toward their destiny rather than sheltering them from their fate. Did Frankie Yale save Al Capone's life, or did he just create America's most dangerous criminal empire? Drop a comment and let me know what you think about the exile that became a coronation, because next week we're diving into Capone's first night in Chicago, when he walked into Johnny Torrio's office with nothing but Brooklyn scars and walked out owning an entire city block. The conversation that turned a refugee into a king will blow your mind, and the handshake deal they made that night would eventually control every drop of illegal liquor from Michigan to Indiana. Subscribe and hit that bell, because the Chicago chapter of the Al Capone legend is just getting started, and trust me, Brooklyn was just the warm-up act.